Otherwise, yes. Thank you, Vittorio. Now, in this presentation, I would like to focus my attention on a specific point out of the many points that have been tackled with in these 2 days, etc. The point is briefly the following. In addition to the necessary mitigation policy and adaptation policies, we should start considering also the transformation policy. Mitigation policies, as we know, aim at the progressive elimination of anthropogenic factors that produce the Earth's temperature increase, thereby reducing climate risk. In other words, bending the warming curve down with the adoption of nature-based solutions. On the other hand, adaptation policies aim to protect health, human society, and the natural environment from the impacts of climate pressures on them. In other words, such policies tend to reduce the exposure and vulnerability to unavoidable climate risk by enhancing adaptive capacity. All this remains valid and therefore necessary, but I do believe that they are not sufficient. The time is come to take into serious consideration transformation policies whose ultimate target would be to modify first the lifestyle, second, to enact mass education in ecological citizens, third, to actively involve civil society organization, fourth, to enhance a major engagement of science, both natural science and social economic science, and fifth, updating the institutional setup of our market economy. So let me elaborate briefly on these basic points. Now, a fundamental, if I haven't left the paper, so I skip the quotations and the sources. If you are interested, you can find in the paper. A frequent question today is the following. Are policies designated to avert climate change politically costly? Because that is one of the major points yesterday, those governors and mayors who intervened stressed. Now, a very recent accurate piece of research by OECD finds that climate change policies not necessarily are politically costly. So, and they provide a lot of empirical evidence to do that, to say so. So, if so, how can we explain the hesitancy of politicians in this regard? In other words, why, apart from few exceptions, governments remain hesitant despite the availability of effective ways to intervene on climate change and related matters? It seems to me that one answer has to do with the following question. As we know, the problem turns out to choose the transition pathway from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium that all of us want to achieve. Three potential transitions can be devised. Under a first scenario, which is called accelerated transition, the current energy crisis would trigger a green transition starting immediately, thereby allowing economies to reach emissions reduction by 2030 that were compatible with the 1.5 Celsius degree maximum target at the end of the century. Under the second scenario, which is called the late push transition, recent adverse macroeconomic developments would lead to a green transition starting next year. It would be sufficiently intense to achieve similar emission reduction by 2030, thanks to strong and decisive actions, albeit also with higher cost than under the first scenario. Finally, under the third scenario, which is called the delayed transition, the transition itself would start with a delay of 3 or 4 years from now, and would be smoother, therefore being less costly. However, emissions would be on a path only compatible with a temperature increase of around 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, American Fed, European Central Bank, and OECD have recently released a very important report in this regard, where they try to evaluate the pros and the cons of the three scenarios. And as you know, the implementation of the scenario is a typical political political duty. Now, the results of these exercises show that acting immediately and decisively, in other words, adopting the accelerated transition scenario, would provide significant benefits for firms, households, and the financial system, not only by maintaining the economy on the optimal net zero emission path, and therefore limiting the impact of climate change, but also by rapidly reducing their energy expenses and lessening the financial risk. If the transition, on the other hand, is further delayed, the only way to reduce emissions compatibly with the net zero targets would be to act more intensively at a later stage. And this raises an issue of intergenerational justice, as Vittorio in his presentation a few minutes ago said, with an abrupt and strong transition that would lead to a weaker economy and higher annual expected losses for the financial system over the horizon set for this exercise. So the results also show an orderly and smooth transition, but starting with a 3 years delay, as I said, would lead by 2030 to risk levels comparable to those implied by an immediate and accelerated transition. However, emission reductions would clearly undershoot the policy goal of a maximum rise in temperature of 1.5%, accelerating the impact of physical risk in the long term. Now, in this regard, a special big problem, at least from my point of view, is the following. While the ecological transition is universally perceived as a need that can no longer be postponed, the global south is driven back into the arms of fossil fuels in the name of debt. And that is a really serious problem. This is what the British organization called Debt Justice denounces in its report, which was published 2 months ago. From 2010 to 2021, the public debt of the countries of the global south has doubled its weight on GDP, rising from 35% to 60% of their domestic product. And that increased not only to domestic creditors, but also to foreign creditors. From 2010 to today, the share of public debt to foreign creditors increased by 10 percentage points from 19 to 29th of the gross domestic product. The conclusion is that from 2011 to today, the sums disbursed by the global south in payment of foreign debt increased by 150%, reaching unprecedented peaks. The United Nations estimates that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on health and education. These are facts, are not theories or hypotheses. And since many of these sums have to be paid in dollars or euros because they are owed to foreign creditors, the problem for each country is not only to increase its tax revenues, but also to increase its export earnings. Some countries by now with a good industrial apparatus, can try to push manufactured exports. But the less industrialized ones have no choice but to increase the exports of natural resources, including coal, gas, oil. Roughly half of the 66 least developed countries have fossil fuels in their subsoil, and are planning to extract more of them to meet their financial commitments. Moreover, among the creditors of the South, that are also states and companies, that in order to protect themselves against the risk of non-payment, have provided for the possibility of being paid directly in kind through the delivery of oil or the transfer of ownership of wells held by debtor government. This is a really tragic problem. Despite multiple declarations by governments and institutions in the North that they no longer want to finance fossil fuels extraction, many of these countries in the North continue to provide loans to open new production sites in the South. According, again, to Debt Justice, in the last 3 years, the multilateral banking system, of which the World Bank is the leader, granted a total of US $10 billion, in loans for fossil fuel extraction. And history will tell whether it was a bargain for the global South to go into that to increase fossil fuel production. But right now, we can say that it is a better deal from an environmental point of view, because the increased carbon dioxide emissions that will result will worsen an already bad picture. So now you understand why changing the rules of the economic and financial games at the international level, it is impossible to find a solution. We can mitigate, we can adapt, but we'll. So to conclude, what I would like to stress is that perhaps time has come to speak in defense of a World Environmental Organization, which does not exist yet. We have many international organizations established in 1944 at Bretton Woods, but not. And without such an organization, it would be impossible to solve the so-called political trilemma. The trilemma consists in putting in harmony the three dimensions of the sustainability issue: the environmental dimension, economic dimension, and the social dimension. And that is why in meetings like the present ones, in my opinion, are important. And we need to circulate the work of these 3 days in order to push. Also because this September, as you know, in New York, the United Nations will organize an extraordinary assembly, the title of which is a Pact for the Future. And if you look at the agenda of the assembly, one of the points is exactly this one: to establish a World Environmental Organization. Thank you very much.